Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for our event tonight entitled Can and Should the Human Rights Project Be Saved? My name is Dan Sheely, and it's my honor to serve as Executive Director of the two units that are co-presenting tonight's event. First, the University of Pennsylvania's Program for Research on Religion and Urban Civil Society, which we call PRUX. And second, the Collegium Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture. For the latter, Collegium, it is our 10th annual reception at the Penn Club of New York. And we thank so many of you here with us this evening who prioritize this event year after year. I was telling Lawson earlier, I think he might have come to as many as I have. We also welcome those who are here with us for the first time. You join us to celebrate, I hope, but also to think deeply about pressing questions for our university community and beyond. Interestingly, if not providentially, tonight's event returns us to some of the questions surfaced by our very first Penn Club event 10 years ago. That one featured Professor Ron Granieri, who is Director of Research at Penn's Lauder Institute for Management and International Studies, speaking on the decline of Christian democracy and the crisis of the European Union. But if then our concern was the distrust of any moral center for Europe, what now might be the basis for pursuing moral unity worldwide? Or even bracketing the global? Might a refined human rights discourse supply that basis here in the United States as we reflect this year on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration and its fundamental appeal to inalienable rights? Okay, now before we launch right into the conversation, and before even introducing our speakers, please allow a few words of thanks. So first, to our co-sponsors, First Things. Okay, we're doing this. Yeah, very good. The Portsmouth Institute for Faith and Culture. America Media. The Thomas Merton Institute for Catholic Life at Columbia University, and the Harvard Catholic Forum. So many of you have been promoting this annual conversation year after year, and we're grateful to you all for contributing to it. And someone who has been with us since the very first reception, Barbara Nevels of the Penn Club, leading the superb staff here. So thank you to Barbara and her team. I must also express profound gratitude to the Collegium team, represented here by Maura Mimna Thibault, whom you saw up here earlier and was extremely effective in getting you all in your seats on time. I'm profoundly grateful for that, as well as everything else she does. Joe Perez-Benzo, Quinn Moore, Mary Lee, together with Isaiah Weir, and employee alumni who are here, and some of our students who traveled up to Penn to join us for the celebration. And there is much to celebrate. Celebrate from what you all have accomplished, some of which you have noted in your seats here with the newly minted 2025 annual report. So 2025 was a record-breaking year for attendance, both for students and faculty, as well as for financial growth, for the development of a 4-credit course series on religion and spirited debate, and other significant benchmarks that demonstrate the promise of a Catholic vision in support of our pluralist university community, one that might indeed impact the discourse and leadership of our broader society. And finally, let me thank the Collegium trustees and supporters, many of whom gathered today to help us chart a strategic vision for the next decade of growth that I hope we can all forge ahead with together for the common good. For tonight's format, after I introduce our distinguished guests, Professor Glendon will speak first for approximately 20 minutes as the 30th anniversary of her seminal 1991 book, Rights Talk, which is a prop on the table there, provided the inspiration for tonight's event. And reading it again, I confess I didn't read it in 1991, but reading it in 2026, I was amazed at how much it continues to speak to our contemporary issues. Next will be Professor Simmons, who will offer a comment of 7 to 8 minutes. Then we will have a moderated conversation. No, you want more? No. Okay, yes. We'll work it out, yeah. Then we will have a moderated conversation among the three of us for approximately 20 minutes, followed by audience Q&A in the final half hour until we close at 8:15 and reopen the reception. Okay, now for the brief introduction to our speakers. Mary Ann Glendon is the Learned Hand Professor of Law Emerita at Harvard University and former U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See. Professor Glendon chaired the U.S. State Department Commission on Unalienable Rights and served as a member of the Commission on International Religious Freedom and the U.S. President's Council on Bioethics. She received the National Humanities Medal in 2006 and served as president of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, member of the Board of Supervisors at the Institute of Religious Works, and leader of the Vatican delegation to the 1995 UN Women's Conference in Beijing. Besides her monograph Rights Talks, some of her many trailblazing books include The Transformation of Family Law, winner of the Legal Academy's highest honor, the Order of the Coif Triennial Book Award, Abortion and Divorce in Western Law, winner of the Scribes Book Award for Best Writing on a Legal Subject, Traditions in Turmoil, a collection of essays on law, culture, and human rights, and A World Made New, Eleanor Roosevelt and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Beth Simmons is the Andrea Mitchell University Professor of Law, Political Science, and Business Ethics at the University of Pennsylvania. She researches and teaches international relations, international law, and international political economy. Her books, Who Adjusts? Domestic Sources of Foreign Economic Policy During the Interwar Years, and Mobilizing for Human Rights, International Law in Domestic Politics, won the American Political Science Association's Woodrow Wilson Award for the best book published in the United States on government, politics, or international affairs. Simmons previously served as director of Harvard's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, president of the International Studies Association, and has been elected to the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. It's a pleasure and honor to have you both with us here. And let's begin with remarks of Professor Glendon.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel. And thank all of you for being here. Greatest successes and where the worst violations continue. Now, as to whether there's any hope that those principles could be reinvigorated, I would say at present the outlook is pretty dim. But just as it happened in 1945. Support for the Universal Declaration and for human rights in general today is still quite strong outside the great powers. I'll give you two examples, very recent examples, where two of the world's largest political organizations have enthusiastically reaffirmed the importance of the Universal Declaration as still, they use that word, still the best expression of universally acceptable principles. One of those organizations is Centrist Democrat International, which is the successor to Christian Democrat International, and it includes political parties in 83 countries with 109 political parties in those countries, mostly in Europe and in Latin America. The second large organization, this may surprise you, it is the world's largest Muslim political organization, the 100 million member Reform Muslim group that is mostly based in South Asia and that is committed to religious tolerance, religious pluralism, and human rights as expressed in the UDHR. It should be better known in the West. So I have to say, having given those two examples, I have to say that also, just as in 1945, I don't think those efforts really have much of a chance unless they have the backing of the liberal democracy that made all the difference back in 1945, namely the United States. So that is why in 2020, the U.S. State Department, it had a commission called the Commission on Unalienable Rights, and its members included Democrats, Republicans, independents like myself, human rights activists, and human rights scholars. We unanimously urged the United States to resume its historic role as a champion of fundamental freedoms. That was the number one conclusion of the report we issued actually in Constitutional Hall in Philadelphia in 2020. And at the time, a reporter asked, well, what's to prevent this report of yours from just ending up on some dusty library shelf, lost and forgotten? Well, he was prescient. I have to admit that neither the administration then in office nor the two administrations elected since have shown the slightest interest in all the work that we did. But I will close by saying that I do remain hopeful that someday the United States will resume its historic role as a champion of human rights. And Daniel, do I have a couple minutes, one more minute? I just would like to quote one sentence from our report, which was this: "It must be recognized that the American model will serve as an inspiration to others only so long as we ourselves recognize the gap between our principles and the imperfections of our politics, and can demonstrate, as we ask of others, tangible efforts at improvements." Thank you.
How is 7 minutes going to do it? Professors are used to going an hour minimum, right? So I don't know how this is going to work. But if I get to the point where, they stand up and say my time is done, there's always the social hour afterwards, where I understand the bar will be open again and we'll just take it up again. But I really feel very happy to be here today to comment on Professor Glendon's work. I reread it pretty carefully. And I found three things that I took away from her Rights Talk book. One is the very important aspect that when you're thinking about human rights, that community must be in balance with individual rights. So I think that's a really important theme that comes up in that book that I want to make a few comments on today. Secondly, that responsibilities have to balance with rights. So the talk of rights must be complemented with a sense of duty and a sense of responsibility as well. So another very important aspect of that book, that the theme, actually the golden thread in my opinion, that goes through that book that is so worthwhile. And then of course the very general theme that human dignity is more important than sort of narrow rules of law. Winning a case is not the important thing. It's the protection of human dignity. And I found those three themes to be very important. Now today, the emphasis is on three questions, and I'm just going to follow them very closely. The first is Professor Glendon's idea, her speculation about why the Human Rights Project is now in crisis. Secondly, discussing why it should be invigorated. And thirdly, concluding with her thoughts on how that might be accomplished. I am going to agree with 2 and 3. I'm going to push back strong on number 1. I don't think we're in crisis. I don't think we're in crisis. And I might begin that by saying that I'm a political scientist, okay? What's the difference between a political scientist and a legal scholar? Generally speaking, one big difference is that legal scholars believe law matters. They have very high expectations. Political scientists believe that power is the currency, right? We have very low expectations. So one of us is going to believe that the glass is half empty, the other is going to believe that the glass is half full. We might believe just about the same things about the world. One of us is more surprised than the other. Okay? So this is what I think, we need to sort of keep that in mind. So I don't think we're in crisis. And perhaps the reason I don't think we're in crisis is because my expectations may have been lower. Okay? They may have been lower. So I challenge the premise of the question itself. And I'll start with one point. It's important to distinguish between the crisis of human rights and the crisis of advocacy for human rights. Okay? I will concede the latter is in a bit of a kind of a weak and a fragmented and a sort of without its kind of rudder at the current moment. But I don't think that we can really say that human rights per se are in any kind of crisis. To claim a right is absolutely one of the most affirming things that a person can do. And while that might be fragile in practice, it is something that people cling to. They cling to that idea, and in particular, once they've been through discussions and been exposed to different viewpoints. And I would also add that to claim a right is not always to act as an individual. To claim a right is also to say, I want to be like you. I want to join humanity. It is a joining action and not always a separating kind of an action to claim a right. There is a very important social aspect to say, I want to join humanity and enjoy the rights that all of humanity has because I'm human too. So doing so asserts not only my humanity, but it also affirms humanity at large. A right to participate in the polity that I live in, a right to gather under the same legal protections without discrimination, a right to live among you and not detained arbitrarily, tortured, or killed. I just want to be like you. I'm not claiming anything special for myself. I just want to join humanity. Is that idea in crisis? I don't think that idea is in crisis. I think that's a very strong and compelling way to think about the Human Rights Project. I have to admit I got stuck a little on this idea of the Human Rights Project. What is that, right? Is it rights per se? I don't think it's that. Is there a human rights crisis in practice? Maybe the crisis is that practice lags the theory of rights. And that's a very strong possibility. Now, how many of you have heard of one or more human rights violations this week? I think most of you have. Okay. How many of you have heard of a human rights affirmation this week? Yeah, that's why we think we're in crisis, right there. Because the media does report on rights, as they should. I'm not saying they shouldn't. But we got to be careful about the inferences we draw from that. So that's really a very important point to keep in mind as well. The other thing I think is important to keep in mind is that maybe we think the Human Rights Project should have achieved more than it has by this time. This goes back to the question of, are we surprised, or are we, and which way are we surprised, right? As a political scientist would be surprised, or perhaps as a legal scholar would be surprised. But I always think it's important to ask the question. I'm a social scientist, so I have to ask the question, compared to what? Compared to what? So what if there'd never been a UDHR? What if there'd never been a whole series of treaties that came after that, to which states could commit themselves legally? Would that be a world that would be better or worse than the one we're in now? So I think that's important to sort of say, what are we comparing human rights practice to? Are we comparing it to the perfect ideal of the law, or are we comparing it to a world in which those laws would never existed in the first place? Those norms would never exist in the first place. Now, I'm not denying that rights violations are widespread. I just would not use the word crisis for it. No, so why do I push back against the idea of crisis? Because, as Professor Glendon has taught us, words matter. And a crisis in advocacy is not a crisis in rights. Rights advocacy, you have to just think for a moment what it takes to be a human rights advocate, okay? So it's very easy to sort of feel like, that the world is definitely crumbling in terms of rights practice around us. But what's really in crisis, I think, is that it is hard to keep pushing forward with respect to human rights advocacy. Rights advocacy is demanding work. It is crisis-driven, right? Often around wars, often around violence, around revolution and upheaval. It's the kind of job that has an always-on culture, and it's very hard to maintain that over time. It's emotionally stressful. Rights advocates sometimes face threats. And even my students who have done some research for me, themselves not exposed to any human rights violations, but I've just asked them to research aspects of human rights violations, say, Professor Simmons, it's hard to read some of the stuff that you're having us read. Now magnify that many, many fold for those who are exposing themselves to the issue of advocacy. Advocates get worn down. There's high burnout rates. There's a feeling of crisis. And I think that we need to recognize that could very well be true in the advocacy world. But let me now go to the second point where I definitely agree with Professor Glendon, why I believe it should be reinvigorated, though I will not accept the premise of crisis. It should be reinvigorated, Human Rights Project, because human rights affirm our humanity. Human rights institutions have had positive consequences over the last 50 years. So whether or not you believe sort of a more deontological kind of reason, or whether you believe in consequential sorts of justifications, I think both of them are a good reason why it should be reinvigorated. One thing that Professor Glendon did not mention after the UDHR was that a whole series of treaties, of course, were developed after that, right? And they differed from the UDHR. They differed primarily because they were legally binding, but secondarily, and very important, I think, they're voluntary. They do not force the universalization, okay? So that you're allowed reservations, and there are opt-outs for this. But the beauty is commitment matters. So I did a study in which I looked at treaty ratification. And I found that after a state ratified a treaty, coalitions grew around the issues contained in the treaty. The treaties actually helped to mobilize domestic groups to envision themselves as rights holders. They sparked movements that used the treaty to hold their own government accountable for the promises they made. Not Western pressure, but a very ground-up kind of way to hold governments accountable for the promises that they actually made. And we used data to try to demonstrate that things like torture declined around the world because states had committed themselves to the Convention Against Torture. People stood up and said, oh, we shouldn't have to put up with this, and you promised we wouldn't, right? Girls enrolled in school right around the time and increasingly after states would ratify the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. We found religious freedom increased measurably among states that had ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. But how to reinvigorate is the question. I agree with you. We must try to reinvigorate. Now the question is how. Now I'm talking here mostly for people who are interested in pursuing the advocacy of and the support for human rights around the world. And I would say to those folks, it's important to mind our words. Again, rights talk, right? Such an important point, that words really matter. So here's how to make rights advocacy blow up in your face. Name and shame. It's a great way to stimulate backlash. Link universal norms with those of the exporting country. These are American norms, or these are Western European norms. No, that's exactly the great way to provoke elites in a traditional power structure. Criticize the society, criticize the culture, just across the board. It's a great way to provoke popular backlash. So instead, when we think about reinvigorating the human rights project, we should be resisting naming and shaming of a culture or a country as such. We should focus shame on responsible individuals. We should seek commonality. We should stress values we share. We should work from universal norms. And very importantly, I think we should resist nationalism as well. There's nothing American, these are not just American norms, right? I think we can be supportive of the norms without sort of claiming them somehow as we invented them, or we're uniquely supportive of those norms. So to conclude, I just would like to say thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for your terrific book. And I would say your career of contributing in every possible way to understanding both the problems, the possibilities, the difficulties, and the victories as well that human rights have enjoyed. I think your careful assessment of the risks of becoming sort of this isolated human rights holder are very well taken. Your willingness to critique law for its own sake, anyway. I think we probably agree there that a wonderful holding of some kind is not as valuable as a shared set of norms. And I think at the end, we come out on the same side of this debate, even if we reach our conclusions from very different perspectives. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you both. Thank you for those remarks. One thing that we tried to do in our Spirited Debate program is to ensure not just serial monologues, but to promote a real kind of engagement with each other. And so what I'd like to do actually is not begin with my own questions, but rather to start with if one of you has a question for the other that you're wondering about and would like to hear the response on that. Would either of you like to begin?
Well, first of all, I was really glad to hear you say that you don't think we are in a crisis. And I plead guilty to having a certain tendency to, see the dark cloud behind the silver lining. I attribute that to my upbringing. I was brought up by a Congregationalist mother and an Irish Catholic father. I think that combination of Jansenism and Calvinism is a little challenging. I'm trying to be more Italian in my old age, but I think, Beth, you haven't completely convinced me that there is not a crisis. And I think where I am most worried is precisely in those areas where parts of the human rights idea are pitted against other parts of the human rights idea. And that seems to be where most of the controversies in the field are today. And I think the chief one is between the democracy rights in Article 21 and all the other rights that, there are many different kinds of rights, but the ones that particularly come into conflict are the democracy rights and rights that have to do with individual freedoms. And there, I think you see it played out mostly in Europe, but also when first world countries start putting human rights conditions on things that they want to happen in the third world. And I think there, you know, Joseph Weiler described that as the dark side of human rights. I don't like that expression because I think that is built into the project, and it is a healthy thing to be built into the project. Democracy is important, and individual rights are important too. And I think there, I am probably more nervous than you are about the state of I'm more nervous about our democracy rights right now than I am about our individual rights. And I'm going to just say one more thing. I don't want to go on and on, but if you go back and read the Federalist Papers, the founders knew that that their experiment was daring. Axiom of political theory was you can't have a democratic republic in a large territory with a diverse population. And they said, well, we think we can do it. We've got a design for government, but they only had 3 million people. And I think that question has come back with force now, whether the republic can be saved. And I will say, it appalls me that there are some prominent Catholic writers who actually talk about regime change, that liberal democracies don't last, this one has had its day. And I just think we have to, those democratic rights are in trouble, we have to admit it. And that brings me one more comment, which is, you said that lawyers think that law matters, and political scientists think that power matters. I think what gets neglected is what is in the great motto of the University of Pennsylvania: leges, sine, moribus, vane. I think culture matters, and I think deep trouble in the culture is causing deep trouble with democracy and with human rights.
And did you have also a question? Yes.
Yeah, so my question is, I was convinced a little bit by your rosy outlook on the crisis, but are you convinced a little bit that the crisis is real?
Yes. Half empty, half full. I mean, I'm with you on that. But I came from low expectations. And so, you know, I feel like there's been a lot of positive development. Now, positive developments are not linear, you know. And so there's no reason to think that rights ought to be always linearly practiced or realized. And it strikes me that there are some positive developments going on that we could point to that could suggest that there's some pushback against authoritarian movement. Sometimes they get crushed. And of course, that's the Iranian situation right now, right? Sometimes they vote and they have victory, and that's the Hungarian situation right now. I think that's a very positive development. I don't feel the strong need to be partisan at the moment, but it could be that Americans will pull back from some of the decisions that they have made about the concentration of power in the executive. I think that is, that to me, and the weakness of Congress, are institutional problems that I very much hope that we pull back from, because it strikes me that without, a careful balancing of powers, that you're going to have a serious, not to mention, of course, the politicization of the of certain aspects of the DOJ and the judicial branch as well. But I think really Congress is the problem, a real big part of the problem right now. So I think of this in institutional terms. Is it a right? I think if we exercise our individual right to vote, that we hopefully can find a way to push back against these developments of the concentration of power in the executive and try to encourage a little bit more representation of the people through Congress. So I recognize those are what I see as the main problems.
Well, before you do that, did you have a question?
Yeah. So what if this beautiful book, Rights Talk, with the American flag on the front of it, had been written in another part of the world? Mine's a short question. What if it had been written in another part of the world? Would you have had, it's a critique of American understandings of rights, not rights writ large. In fact, the kind of good model is the European model, right?
I was much more of a Europhile when I wrote that book than I am today. And I am much prouder of, my complaints then about the American mode of rights discourse were contrasted with what comparative law is what I do, European law. And so I was saying, well, look, they have all these things in their constitutions that we don't have. You mentioned human dignity. That's the hermeneutical key to European constitutions. We hardly have it in our constitutional law. Responsibilities, they pair rights with responsibilities. Community, it's all there. And looking at it now, I see actually our practice was better than our theory. And they are, all the great stuff they have in their discourse is being, I would say, invaded by a much more individualistic form of discourse in the European courts. So things went exactly in the direction that I kind of hoped they wouldn't go. I thought we would say more about responsibility and dignity and community, and instead they went. And that brings me back to the culture and the question I was going to ask you. Are you at all worried that changes in the American culture, let us say, I like to quote Peggy Noonan sometimes about, for you people who think that the 90s are the Pleistocene age, the 60s were pre-Pleistocene, but as Peggy Noonan put it, in the 1960s, the whole country went on a toot, and I was there at the party, so I know. I think another way of putting it would be Fulton Sheen said, we have reached the end of Christendom. And by that, he said, he didn't mean the end of the church, he didn't mean the end of Christianity, but the end of a society where most institutions and communities were permeated to a great degree by Christian principles. That worries me. That worries me just because I think that is related to some of the ills of democracy, which, as the founders told us, was going to require more of citizens and statespersons than any form of government previously tried.
Would you broaden that to say maybe not, maybe we don't need to limit it to Christian principles? Maybe we need to say humanistic principles, and maybe we need to say principles of civility. Would that be?
Absolutely.
Because I worry about the potentially divisive nature of reaching for Christianity. Though it is, of course, a very encompassing social community, it also could potentially put kind of a rope around the culture that's supportive of rights.
I think in the last chapter I said something like America's communities, all kinds of ethnic and religious communities, these are the seed beds of the civic virtues that are so necessary to maintain a liberal democracy. And the 1960s did a number on those seed beds. And that's why I quoted the University of Pennsylvania motto that laws without moribus and I think the Latin experts here explained to me that we should translate that not as morals, but as mores in Tocqueville's sense, the entire intellectual and cultural state, the habits and attitudes of the people. I think there would have to be some kind of reinvigorating of the culture in order to reinvigorate the democracy.
Can I ask a question? Is that okay? Oh, no, sorry. No, I don't mean, we'll get right to the audience after this. I did want to ask this sort of semi-quincentennial question here, prompted in part by your insightful question, Beth. Well, what if this book was not written about the United States? But let's go back there. So I really appreciate your careful reading of the book, too, and your recounting of the history. Right, this came out in 1991, which was a euphoric moment for human rights. It seemed that the project was everywhere triumphant, right? And so it's interesting here that you're arguing, you feel like a voice crying out, right? Promoting human rights, where at the time you were one of the earliest ones to raise questions and concerns about the movement in that context. And the questions that I thought Professor Simmons cataloged very well in terms of three were about the questions of community, responsibility, and you would say restraint. And in your final chapter of this book, when you talk about the ways in which we might have a refined human rights dialogue along those lines, that there's promise for that. But I think some of the critics, who you've also responded to, some of whom are in this room, might say, but can you really do that, right? Because if you begin with human rights, then you're beginning with an emphasis or an accent in the wrong place, where you might otherwise begin with justice, right, and community. And so by beginning with human rights, you're setting the groundwork for necessarily eroding those things which might serve to balance it. So this may be a long-winded way of asking this question. So in the 250th anniversary of, when we say it's the 250th anniversary of this country, but it's really the 250th anniversary of the Declaration, right? And the Declaration, its emphasis on inalienable rights. Is that, do we think, if we had to focus on one part to really accent, to emphasize, is that the source of moral unity that we should be reflecting on in this country? Or will we be better served to place it somewhere else?
Were you asking if we should focus on the Declaration? I didn't, as our starting point, because I would say on the anniversary, and sort of answering two of your points here. One is about should we start with human rights? And I would say definitely not, because human rights are part of the package of liberal democracy. And liberal democracy includes not only the principles in the Declaration of Independence, but the structures in the Constitution. The democracy and the human rights go together. They should not be pitted against each other, but they have tensions that need to be managed if the democratic experiment is to succeed. But I think more important than the Declaration of Independence and the structures in the Constitution is back to the motto of the University of Pennsylvania, back to Plato's laws, back to Tocqueville. It's the culture that determines whether the structures will work and whether the principles will be obeyed. And I remain very concerned about the state of the culture.
Would you like to respond to that?
I'm not unconcerned about the state of the culture, in the sense that, some things are pretty, there's a way of talking political discourse now that's totally shocking. And so I think that's a problem. It's kind of obviously in tension with all kinds of good values, in my opinion, right? I guess I'm trying to sort of link that up now somehow with the challenge to human rights per se, and trying to understand how much of the culture is sort of deeply embedded in kind of American society writ large, and how much of it is reflected in the points of view of certain political leaders, for example, right? Is it a culture that is rotting from the bottom up or from the top down? And I don't know. I don't see it. It's hard to answer that kind of a question. But I guess I have to sort of not punt, but I don't know the answer to, what kind of culture is going to necessarily emerge from the current situation that we're in. But yeah, I mean, I have a lot of worry about the stability of American political institutions right now. I think of that as an institutional issue. I think of that as a culture largely at the top, permitted by a lot of other technological and other kinds of developments that are grading away at the institutions that we have in place. If that's kind of a critique of human rights, I don't know. I think it is it's a challenge that's related, but I don't think it's any reason to sort of say human rights is now in crisis. I don't think that's where we are on it. So that's sort of how. The other thing I'm not quite sure if I have to. Maybe we can have a discussion about this, is whether individual human rights are corrosive of social responsibilities and the acceptance of that. I'm not sure this is an either or. Do we have to say that? Yeah. I mean, it doesn't seem to me that they're either or. Coins have heads and tails, don't they? Yeah. And so there's, so it seems to me that it is, they're not substitutes, they're complements. And they can all come from the same value system for that matter, right? So I don't know, the idea somehow that sort of the individualism contained in a lot of our rights is a real challenge to good social living doesn't strike me as necessarily the case, right? I definitely see it with property rights a little bit more than a lot of other kinds of claims. Because as I was trying to sort of say when I was talking, is that I see a lot of the expression of rights claiming as affirmation of joining, right? And to me, that is not an isolating move. That is a move to participate fully in the society and the political system in which I'm ensconced, right? So I don't see these as opposites or as incompatible.
Thank you. Okay, your turn. So Maura has a mic in the back. I'll call from here. Like the first, okay, we got two vying right up here in the front. We'll try to move around the room. So why don't we start over here? We'll work our way around. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I was glad you brought up technology because it seems like a burning question. I just read, I'm going to butcher his name, Brzezinski's book on the technocratic age from 1970. He said we're ushering in a new age back then because of technology. And now we're on the cusp of AI, it seems, where I wonder the trope that words matter, is that true anymore for the coming generation? And this is all a long segue to just a very practical question with the idea of rights and responsibilities together. Do we need to teach the coming generation that reality and then instead of just speaking to them with things like compulsory service? What do you think about that in America like they have in Europe and other places? Thank you.
Do you want to respond to that first?
Yeah, I like the idea of compulsory service. I think it would develop a sort of a more sense of stakedness in the society in which people live. And I think that it would give just a little bit of pause from the project of self-promotion just for the merest time, and at a very critical time in people's lives when they're trying to decide what they really do want to do. And it maybe would open people up to thinking a little bit more about taking on professions that are aimed at the cultivation of a social good, the good life more broadly and socially for people around them. So I think it is a very good, I would of course want it to be a broad kind of an obligation, that there are many things you could do as long as they're socially useful. We could have as much of a debate over what's socially useful as we could over human rights.
Did you want to speak to the tech side of the question at all?
I'll just add a thought to supplement what Professor Simmons said, and that is that the experience of integrating the armed forces did wonders for race relations in the United States. And it was a cultural factor that just the experience of the working side by side, getting to know each other. So one could foresee maybe some alleviation of our political divisiveness through compulsory service.
Great. And since we already have a few hands up, I just also wanted to mention, usually what I do at the beginning is say, we encourage our students to give them the priority for asking the initial questions. But the good news is we already have a few hands up, so you have time to gather your questions, but we're coming to you. So first, though, in the front row here.
Thank you guys for joining us. A lot of conversation about the upcoming generation, so I'll represent the cynical view of the young person in the room. So my mother's Cuban and my father's a Kurd from Iraq. So I don't like totalitarians and I don't like genocide. They're bad things. But when I hear the Human Rights Project and I see its legacy, and as a young person and I see its impact that it's had, I see that it's kind of evacuated the moral significance of the ideas that allowed it to arise in the first place. This is the conversation that I often hear young people having about human rights. The most evil being that someone can think of is not Satan, it's not Judas, it's not Pharaoh, it's Hitler. And Hitler's a bad guy, but what about all the moral work that was done, the intellectual traditions that came before the Human Rights Project, where it feels like today we're kind of moving to the lowest common denominator and abandoning the ideas that allowed it to take place in the first place, and maybe that's why we're losing it in the first place.
I mean, I think you obviously make a really important point, is we didn't kind of just develop any kind of moral sense in 1945. That's absolutely true. That human rights in any kind of moral sense has very deep roots in culture, in religion, in philosophical orientations. So it does seem to me that you have a point that to sort of start this conversation somehow in 1945 is kind of a convenient start, but it is hardly a full story of the unfolding of human rights over time, that's for sure. It is, I think, we can both say, the first time that law kind of seriously was brought to bear with respect to some of these kind of moral sensibilities. I think you obviously hit the nail right on the head with the evils of Hitler. And my understanding of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is it was really trying to stop the kinds of things that happened during the Hitler regime. So there's reference to medical experimentation and practice, for example. So I think you're absolutely right. For convenience, we have sort of modernized the discussion, but I think that's a really important thing to recognize, is that all of these values reflected in rights have pretty deep roots in culture and history.
I guess I would just add that the group of people who got together to frame the Universal Declaration, it was an astonishing multicultural mix. And one of the first things they had to decide is, well, what kinds of ideas can have a reasonable claim to be universal? And they decided to be quite modest. I mean, it has 30 articles, but they aren't all about rights. There are hermeneutical cues throughout the whole document. So they ended up, I think Jacques Maritain was the person who expressed it most clearly. They were looking for principles that could be grounded in nearly all of the world's cultural, philosophical, and religious traditions, obviously not nihilism, and that they probably, when they're talking about international rights, universal rights, probably wise to stick to that and let other kinds of questions be worked out through national processes or ordinary democratic processes.
Okay. I think James over here, been waiting.
Thank you, Maura. Thank you, Professor Glendon and Professor Sims, for coming out here tonight. This has been very interesting. I might be better off without the mic.
No, it's working. I think it's working.
It's working? Okay,
Yeah.
great. In my own observations, I've seen people and groups of people claiming rights as basic human rights that keep expanding the definitions, okay? So that groups seem to be claiming human rights that other groups will not recognize. And I guess my question is, if you think that this expansion of the definition of human rights is causing our culture to start disregarding the concept of general human rights that emerge, whether from natural law or from God, and they've turned rights into whatever my group has the power to enforce. And is that part of the crisis? Thank you.
Yeah, well, if I were to go over the list of what I think has brought the human rights idea into crisis, it would be precisely that a whole lot of people wanted to jump on the train in the 1990s, and the human rights idea showed its power to the point where human rights organizations devoted to ideas that were not part of the original consensus grew up. So I do think that proliferation of rights, which the framers of the Declaration avoided on purpose, it tends to undermine the claim to universality. It tends to increase clashes with democratic rights, trying to convince your neighbors rather than to go to bargain, educate, persuade, and then vote. And if the vote gets it wrong, do it over again, rather than go to a court where it's almost always all or nothing. So I think a modest approach to what can be considered a slam down right is probably the key to success, and proliferation of rights is probably going to undermine the whole idea further.
Did you want to speak to it?
I'm going to push back just a little bit on this because I think one thing I would add to the Universal Declaration is that now we have a series of treaties, right? Treaties are a matter of consent. So states have to agree to treaty to be bound by them, except there are other bodies of law that we won't get into, that are also kind of basic under norms that are sort of accepted as binding on all. But it seems to me that it feels to me that it's not such a bad thing to have some tolerance for your society will select those rights through your voting processes. And that's what treaties are for. That's what the ratification process is for. And not only that, they can opt out of certain pieces of the treaties as well. So I think that there are ample mechanisms to attempt to fashion some kind of consensus, sort of as a national movement. Now, the other thing I want to say is that another reason why I think we have to be a little tolerant toward accepting a little broader sets of rights than we might sort of choose if we were the ones making the decisions is that there are people for whom it is an existential matter. Okay? So, I mean, I think, for example, homosexual rights, for example. I think that's an existential issue. And it may seem peripheral to the mainstream culture, but it is a matter of life and death. Literally a matter of life and death around the world. So I think we need to have some, some insistence that we are willing to support some rights for some people that might not have been our absolute preference of sort of menu of rights, right? But we need to recognize that for some it's an existential issue, and therefore they should have the same rights as all other human beings for the pursuit of their well-being as well, it seems to me. So I just wanted to push back a little, because I'm not sure what the proliferation of these rights exactly are, what you may be referring to. There are certainly some rights that I think are less than others, You mentioned some in your book, I think. You talk about consumer rights, and you sort of, don't you? You list off a set of rights which sort of seem like, just pin the word right after anything. And yes, that gets very annoying, and it trivializes. Yes, it does. It can go that far, that's for sure. But I think I would just really urge that we have tolerance for a set of rights that we recognize that other people see as existential, even if we would not have preferred that right ourselves. So it seems to me that I'm pushing back just ever so slightly on that, if that's okay.
Thank you. There's pushback with James, but maybe pushback here too. But I'll go to the next question. We have one over here, and then we'll get out of the corner, I think.
Pope Leo is a canon lawyer who's steeped in the natural law tradition and has started teaching. Pope Leo is a canon lawyer who's steeped in the natural law tradition and has started teaching about it, at least in a kind of retail way in private audiences, in a way that seems philosophically grounded and potentially accessible to people outside the Christian tradition. If you as a civil lawyer or a political scientist, as the case may be, if you had 30 minutes with him and could advise him in one or two ways on how to present the natural law tradition philosophically with an eye to reinvigorating the human rights tradition, what would you advise him?
Wow. I think that the head of the Roman Catholic Church, in his role as head of a sovereign state, has really important, and I've seen this with my own eyes, sitting in the United Nations when John Paul II was addressing the United Nations. You could have heard a pin drop. And it was standing room only. And why? Because I think the diplomats there, each one with his own portfolio and his set of interests that he or she is bound to represent to the fullest of his or her ability, they had the sense that they were listening to someone who was not speaking for a particular sovereign state or a particular church, but trying to speak for all of humanity. And I think that is where religious leaders like the Pope, when they speak at the level of principle with a moral voice, that is where they are most effective. And when they are least effective is when they get into policy and recommendations on matters where you or I or anybody in the room, our opinion is as good as someone who is a great religious leader. So I do think that he does very well at being that moral voice. I think just because of that period of euphoria when there was so much happening transformational in the world, I think that John Paul II's papacy is one where that moral voice, together with other political factors, was a huge element.
And he never descended into specific policy.
No, okay. All right, I want to make sure we get over to Rusty Reader out of questions. He's been. No, you didn't. Oh, you were just doing this. Oh, okay. Okay. All right. Okay. We got. I promise we get to a student at some point. Okay, we got. It looks like Isaiah in the back is ready. Yeah.
I'm curious, especially for Professor. I'm curious, especially for Professor Simmons, when we're looking at this like renewed cultural humanism in the culture to fight the human rights battle. Do you feel there's a need, and if you do feel, how would you go about addressing that need to push back against strands of modern thought that would devalue the unique dignity of the human person? Anything? No? Okay. So like Peter.
Wait, say that again.
So like Peter Thiel sort of doesn't really care about humanity, sees value more in this technological transhumanism.
Is that what you're asking me?
Yeah, or on the other side, there are people who would sort of devalue humanity and see animals as like equally as valuable.
I think there's a difference between animals and human beings. So there is something about humans that are, we want to give a certain amount of dignity. Now, this doesn't mean we want to be mean to animals. I'm against that too, right? So I support the SPSA, and all that. So I think, but I don't speak about it in terms of rights. Let's put it that way. Okay, I speak about it in terms of, can we refrain from cruelty? Can we, treat animals well? They deserve. I'll just use the word deserve. I won't use the word rights. But they deserve to be fed. They deserve to be sheltered, and they deserve not to be kicked around. So I would say there is something pretty unique and special about being human. And I do think it's degrading in some sense to, but I want to be careful because there's other cultures who see inanimate and natural phenomenon as something holistically connected to humans. And I want to have the proper respect for that without saying that I would in favor elevating the rivers to personhood. You see what I'm saying? So it's not my way of understanding. And it seems to me that we really have a lot of work to do just in the human rights area. And it seems to me that takes a lot of our concentrated effort right now. And I think the environmentalists are doing good work in the environmental area, and that's the way we should be talking about that. So there are plenty of constructive ways to pursue other values than to assign sort of something equivalent to human rights to everything that's out there, right?
You have an interesting example in your book too, just on this point about the ecological movement, that framing that in terms of rights not only seems to be not the most effectual, but also kind of incoherent. Whereas bringing up biblical principles of stewardship, it seems to be more mobilizing. Okay, all right. Okay, so I'm getting a sign. Yeah. Okay. Oh, one more. Okay. Can I do something a little bit, Craig? Because they're both sitting right next to each other here. Can you ask your questions serially, but one and then the other, and then these two could choose which one they want to respond to. Yeah.
Sure. So, a couple of pushbacks. I think first of all, so as you mentioned about the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, inalienable rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. I think two of those are existential. Life and liberty are existential. Pursuit of happiness is tolerance, but not existential. Then I think when you think about that and to really dig down even deeper to that is just the moray concept of good versus evil, right? I think good versus evil is a fairly, maybe it's a little gray area in the middle, but it's pretty black and white. that people could probably agree to from a universal perspective, which brings me to the question of Pope Leo and good versus evil. As an Augustinian-raised pope, where your groundbreaking philosophy around a just war theory, how would Pope Leo, or how should Pope Leo, look at what's happening in Iran as whether or not it's a just war based upon the number of deaths, the number of people that may have been suppressed over time, right? Good versus evil, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your remarks. I work for a pro-life group at the United Nations, and so this discussion is very important to me and the work we do there. But I guess what I've noticed is that there is a profound semantic crisis within the Human Rights Project. And it seems to me that there is no longer a shared understanding of what constitutes the project itself, and someone else touched on this idea of perhaps some new rights, or let's say universal rights being added into it. What I've noticed is that this has caused a profound fragmentation between people who are, and organizations who are there and who are committed to multilateralism and let's say the UDHR, but who are now called anti-rights. So I guess my question is, do you have any hope that there might be some unity at some point, so that that which is universal and basic is again worked on by more people, or and if so, how do you think that might come about?
Who wants to go first? Okay.
Is that me then? I mean, I don't think we should force universalism. I guess I want to resist this. It's sort of like the answer to your question too about the proliferation of rights. I'm not that worried about that. I think a lot of the rights that we see that are enumerated again and again, the number of rights, a lot of them are actual redundancies, very close to each other, and many of them reinforce each other as well. So you can have a right to an education in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and you can have the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, reinforcing that for women, right? So I'm not that worried about rights proliferation at the core. What I am worried about are people trivializing. I think that is a problem. But I don't feel like there's a whole set of rights at the core of international human rights law that is utterly distracting. I really don't feel like that. I'm just going to state that right now. I've read most of these treaties, and I actually find that most of what they contain is really quite important. And we even talked about the economic, social, and cultural rights, a right to health, and that type of thing. But it seems to me that the core of international human rights law, which I take to be the menu of serious possibilities for the Human Rights Project, is suitably variegated. And to try to sort of force into the core seems to me to forego an opportunity to allow ideas to percolate about what else might be a right here, and eventually to persuade and to vote. It seems to me that the periphery is something that we should tolerate, not force, and not panic about quite so much. I'm not sure that's the problem. I think the problem is with repressive governments, and I think that will always tend to be, and I guess some repressive practices within cultures as well. That will be more of an issue, a difficult issue, and it seems to me that that's different from the problem of rights proliferation. I'm not that worried about a little bit of fractiousness. I can tolerate that.
Well, you asked about hope, and I think it would be nice to, as we're drawing to a close, to think about sources of hope.
And I have to say, one of the things that I still have confidence in is the power of reason and goodwill. And many of these things that are dividing our society and many of these things that get articulated as rights are, if not solvable, they are manageable if people can sit down and talk to each other about them. You work in the pro-life movement, and I've spent many years in the pro-life movement. And one of the things I found when I did an actual study of abortion regulation in 26 countries and the actual abortion rates in those countries, there's not much correlation between abortion law and abortion rates. What do pro-lifers want? They want more children to have a chance at life, more unborn children to have a chance at life. So the right question to ask would, what would maximize the chances for those unborn children to have a chance at life?
What would enhance the chances of born children?
Exactly. Exactly. So, I mean, more if you sat down a group of people in a room, and I've been in many of these conversations with leaders of both pro-choice and pro-life movements, you can get a lot of consensus about helping women who are in a crisis, the worst crisis of their lives, and so on. So I think what we really have to do is search for those opportunities for honest discussion about hard issues, to keep in mind compromise is the essence of democracy. And I'll just come back to the thought that I think what is really at risk is democracy, in the liberal democracies. Now, in the rest of the world, there are other things that they're thinking about, and human rights discussion would have to include those. But just in terms of the liberal democracy, I think the liberals at risk and the democracy is at risk, and they're being put at war with each other. And so I am very concerned about people who talk about regime change.
So, a common thread that I'm seeing from this conversation, at least up here on the stage, is that there does seem to be agreement that we are in favor of democratic deliberation and human rights, right, together, and that it's not just a question of human rights, which is the headline of this story, but democratic deliberation is sort of equally needing to be prioritized. Though this last exchange also helped me to reappreciate why universal human rights still need to be a crucial part of that conversation. And to the third question, how do we get to a renewed appreciation for both of these things and not allow one to destroy the other? Well, I think if we turn to the final pages of your book in 1991, you offer us a precedent for hope here. And so I'll read this to conclude. So in his 1990 New Year's address, Czechoslovak President Václav Havel rhetorically asked a question that is pertinent to our own circumstances. How did a people that to all appearances was beaten down, atomized, cynical, and apathetic, we heard some notes of that, find the strength to embark on a great project of social and political renewal? And this is quoting Havel. We ask, where the young people, in particular, who have never known any other system, find the source of their aspirations for truth, freedom of thought, civic courage, and civic foresight? How is it that their parents, the generation which was considered lost, also joined in with them? Havel's first comment on his own question was that, quote, man is never merely a product of the world around him. He is always capable of striving for something higher. A second factor that helped to regenerate a seemingly moribund political life, according to Havel, was the recovery of the, quote, humanistic and democratic traditions that lay dormant somewhere in the subconscious of our nations and national minorities, and were passed on from one generation to the next in order for each of us to discover them within us when the time was right. And I think there's something here for us. There's something here for us, for our university community in 2026. May we too be carriers of these humanistic and democratic traditions with the patience to deliberate moderately, along with the courage to witness boldly. So now, before joining me in feasting boldly in this festive season in the back of the room, please join me again in thanking our speakers, Professor Beth Simmons, Professor Marian Fletcher.